Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Apologies for the technical problems with our first go round. So hopefully this one is going to go a lot better. Um, I am Michael Torra, managing principal at Raben, our regional lead for California, and I'm also a member of our government affairs practice group and our issue campaigns management practice group as well. Um, I have I come to Raben with a decade of experience working on Capitol Hill and for various congressional campaigns. Uh, Joined our DC office and did a lot of government relations work for those first 6 years while I was based in Washington, D.C., and then returned home to California about a decade ago, where I help a lot of clients in California and beyond with navigating and understanding federal policy making, what it means, what the implications are, et cetera. And so with that, I've been very closely following the budget reconciliation process, among many other federal policy developments. And that's why we are going to be providing a presentation to you all today. And I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague, Eduardo Soto. So Eduardo, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Michael. So excited for take two. I'm Eduardo Soto, a principal at the Raben, where I work in government affairs with our government relations clients, but I also advise coalitions and grassroots advocates through our issue campaigns and movements practice. So very excited to cover some of the big ticket items from this super comprehensive piece of legislation now that we're in the process of seeing it implemented and seeing some of the results take hold.
Thanks, Eduardo. So folks, this is what we're going to do. We're each going to speak about the legislation, not all of the content, as Eduardo alluded to. It's a massive piece of legislation. It's really multiple bills that were all glued together. We could spend days. I mean, it would take days to go through all the provisions, but we're going to provide a kind of a quick overview. I'm going to talk about what the implications are for the social safety net. Eduardo is going to speak to the immigration components, and then we wanted to open it up for Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A function so that we can get those and address any questions that you have. So let me get our slide deck up here on the screen as we have several visuals. Here we go, just bear with me. And we should be running here. Oops. All right. So, folks can hopefully see all of that. I just kind of spoke about what our agenda is. So really the big overview of the Budget Reconciliation Act. Now, just one word on the name. I know we all know that a lot of the supporters of the bill and a number of the bill authors refer to it as One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Just to note, that is not actually the official name of the law, the way that it was written into the final bill that Congress voted on. And I have to read it. The actual name is An Act to Provide for Reconciliation Pursuant to Title II of House Concurrent Resolution 14. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But that's why it's often referred to in the media as the budget bill, the tax and spending law, the mega bill. We prefer just for short to call it the Budget Reconciliation Act, and then even shorter, refer to it as HR 1, which is what the bill number was as it worked its way through Congress. Okay, so first of all, we're going to be sharing out the slide deck, so don't feel that you have to squint to read every single item on this slide or do a bunch of screenshots to capture them. So you'll be getting these. But basically, I use this slide just to serve as a reminder of what was the driving force behind this piece of legislation. Each of the colored rectangles on this slide is proportionate to the fiscal impact of those categories of the new law. So the blue rectangles are the tax cuts, and you can see that that is bigger than all the other components combined. whether it's a spending increases, spending cuts, the revenue raisers, right? So really, this really helps to illustrate that this law was driven by tax cuts. That was really the driving factor among the members of Congress who were writing it and advancing it through both chambers of Congress. Now, after the tax cuts, of course, the biggest element are the spending cuts, right? The red and pink boxes, with the overwhelming majority of that being cuts to healthcare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, followed by student loans and SNAP, or nutrition, as food stamps as we know them better. And now the bill also raises revenue, and that's the sort of purple and lavender boxes. But it raises revenue really largely at the expense of the climate, right? The biggest revenue raiser is actually the elimination of various clean energy production incentives. And then another significant piece of the revenue raisers is leasing public lands for fossil fuel production. And then on the spending side, the biggest piece of increased spending is around immigration and border security, which Eduardo will be speaking about. Now, just a note on the tax cut side, because of course the president is messaging repeated over and over again how the tax cuts were going to benefit middle class folks. You can kind of see, hopefully, these dotted lines within the blue rectangles. In the top left corner, there's a relatively small box. That's the fiscal impact of the so-called no tax on tips. It's actually a tax deduction related to tips, overtime, car loan interest, what are called Trump accounts for children. These are all provisions that have been touted a lot by the president, but they expire after 4 years. And as you can see, the actual impact of those pales in comparison to the rest of the tax cuts that are included in this new law that primarily benefit higher income households and large corporations. There is that larger box for the child tax credit. Of course, child tax credit was not structured in a way to be as progressive as it could be. A lot of that is benefiting kind of middle upper income families. And then within business tax cuts, there was talk about, oh, we're going to be investing in economically distressed areas. There's a really tiny box there within the business tax cut section, and that's the opportunity zones, new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credit, et cetera. So again, a very small piece of the overall tax package. So when you balance out sort of that tax policy with the spending cuts that are in this new law, the results when you kind of break it out for what it means by households based on their income is really quite striking. This is a graphic from the Congressional Budget Office, which looks at what the impact is by each sort of decile, right? From the bottom 10% all the way to the top 10% of folks on the income ladder, and then every 10% segment underneath, in between those two. And so what you see at the far left end with those are the lowest 10% on the income ladder, is you see actually a decrease. That dark green is the sort of resources that the average household is going to be losing over the course of a decade. And then sort of the light green and that darker shaded box above that is sort of what they're gaining. And so you can see that those in the bottom 10% are going to be the biggest losers. Those in that second 10% segment also losing out. And then as you go up, then folks begin to have some gains, with no surprise, those in the top 10% really getting the biggest gain to their household resources. Now, when you kind of take all of that and you consider the impact the impact of this law on the federal deficit, it's going to generate another 3.2 trillion dollars in deficit spending over the course of a decade. And you think about what is the impact on So the generation of folks who are just born this year, so babies born in 2025, how are they going to fare over the course of their lifetime as a result of this new law? There you see, and then this is a graphic that was created by the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities using data from the Penn Wharton budget model. Basically, what they find is everyone except those in the top 20% are going to be worse off. Um, all right, so that's kind of the big picture. Let me dive in now into the social safety net and what this law means. First of all, I'm sure you've already heard quite a bit about this, that the law creates or enacts historic cuts, the largest cuts in the history of Medicaid, of the Affordable Care Act, and of the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, better known as food stamps, right? Over $1 trillion out of these programs, well over $1 trillion. 10 million fewer people are going to have health insurance coverage as a result. Over 22 million households are going to lose some or all of their food stamps. I tend to think about these cuts in three different categories. Split those over two slides because they don't all fit on the one slide. The first is cost shift to states. There's cuts, particularly in Medicaid and SNAP, that where the feds are basically saying the states are going to be on the hook for a greater share of the costs of these programs. And even within Medicaid, tying the hands of states in terms of the kind of taxes that they can raise within their states to be able to help pay for state Medicaid programs. Now, remember, particularly with Medicaid and SNAP, these are largely federally funded programs, but they're administered at the state level, right? So every state has their own sort of food stamp or Medicaid program. Sometimes they're called something else, like in California, where we call Medicaid Medi-Cal, and SNAP we call CalFresh. And so what's going to happen is that states are then going to have to figure out how to administer these programs with something like $500 billion less in resources over the course of the decade to be able to administer these programs. So either they're going to have to pass these cuts on to the beneficiaries, to those who are enrolled in these programs by, number one, either not letting them enroll or creating additional barriers to enrollment or just cutting the level of benefits that are available for those who are enrolled. Or they're going to have to cut other state spending to try to plug the holes that have been created by the feds. Or they're going to have to raise taxes within their states to the degree that they can to try to raise the money to plug those holes. Now, I think in many states, it's probably going to be some combination of the three of those things. But as you can tell, none of those options are going to be very popular, whether you're raising taxes or cutting benefits or cutting other programs, important programs. And it's not like states are flush with cash. I mean, most states are not running large budget deficits, so this is not an easy thing to deal with. So just, spare a thought for a moment to state policymakers. They're being handed a very difficult situation by the feds, and they're going to somehow have to figure out how to make it work. And whatever choice they make is going to be really unpopular. And so the risk is that they are going to be the ones left carrying the responsibility, and they're the ones who are going to be held accountable at the ballot box for the difficult decisions they have to make, while the folks at the federal level who made this decision, the members of Congress who voted for it, the person in the White House who signed it into law, completely escape accountability. So next to the next category, and that's really the burdens that are going to be directly felt by people who are enrolled in safety net programs, right? We list out a bunch of the examples of those here on this slide. I won't go through them all, but just to say it's a lot of red tape, right? A lot of hurdles, whether it's the new redeterminations, more frequent verification requirements to remain enrolled in these programs, even the new work requirements in Medicaid, the expanded work requirements in SNAP, those are in and of themselves forms of red tape and hurdles for people to be able to enroll. We saw that when Arkansas had work requirements in the Medicaid in its Medicaid program. About 25% of the people who were subject to the work requirements ended up getting kicked off of Medicaid. And it wasn't because they weren't working. Like over 90% of them were actually working. So it wasn't that they weren't meeting the sort of work requirement. It was just that they weren't filling out the documentation correctly or that they missed a particular notice. Again, it was all just bureaucratic hurdles that were causing people to lose their access to healthcare. And then another component in these burdens is going to be changed in terms of the benefits, right? Those enrolled in Medicaid will have to start paying copays for certain services, so it's going to become more expensive, right? Those enrolled in SNAP and food stamps, over time, the calculation of their benefits is going to change so that the benefit increases will no longer match the rising cost of groceries, but instead be capped at whatever the inflation rate is. So that if the cost of groceries exceeds the rate of inflation, well, the cost of the benefit is not going to match that increase in food prices. And so over time, you're going to see an erosion of the power of those benefits. And then the third category really is just the various restrictions being placed on immigrants across various programs. And here you just see how that's going to impact various safety net programs. Really what Congress has sought to do in this new law is to basically say that public benefits are only going to be available to three categories of immigrants. Those with green cards, certain Cuban and Haitian immigrants, and then migrants from former U.S. Territories in the Pacific. And that's pretty much it. And then they go even a step further in that and going after folks with green cards who are subject to a 5-year bar from access or waiting period for accessing Medicaid. Currently, or up until this law was signed, those folks would be able to still access subsidized coverage through the Affordable Care Act's health insurance marketplaces. They won't be able to do that anymore. They'll be completely locked out. So those are the rather draconian restrictions being placed on immigrants in this new law as it relates to the safety net. Now let's just talk about implementation and the outlook as it relates to the cuts to the safety net. So a few key things that I just want to leave you with as it relates to implementation. Number one is timing, and this is very important. Not all of these changes kick in right away. Many of these phase in over time. In fact, a lot of the safety net cuts that will directly impact folks who are enrolled in these programs were actually timed to occur after the midterm elections. I'm sure that was no coincidence. And on the next slide, we've got a timeline that provides examples of when certain key provisions will kick in. Second is that federal agencies are going to have a lot of work to do in terms of implementing this new law. Different provisions, and there are hundreds of provisions in this law, will require some type of guidance or even regulations from federal agencies in order to be implemented. And so agencies are giving varying degrees of discretion in terms of how to implement the law. In some provisions, the law is very crystal clear. There's a lot of parameters. In other provisions, agencies are given a lot of leeway in terms of how to implement that. And so what that means, particularly in those instances where agencies have a lot of leeway and a lot of discretion, there's going to be an opportunity to weigh in with those agencies to try to shape what that implementation guidance or implementation regulations, what those look like, right? Now, obviously, certain stakeholders are going to be better positioned than others to have influence with this particular administration, but there's certainly that opportunity there. Next, there's the role that states play. I've already talked about that to a certain degree. I'll just add that since states are going to be on the hook to implement a lot of these changes, there's going to be some opportunity to engage states around um, how to implement them in a way that is at least somewhat less onerous, right? So if we think about states being required to check people's eligibility to be enrolled in safety net programs more frequently and to ask more questions related to their eligibility. How can they do that in a way that's going to be easy for working people to navigate, right? That's like a user-friendly system that's not going to trip them up and not going to prevent them from being able to access the benefits that they need. Um, and then lastly, around public communications, it's going to be really important. There's going to be so much work ahead to be able to communicate with folks um, what changes are coming to the safety net programs that provide a lifeline to them, how to navigate those changes, but then also to understand why they're happening and who's responsible for them, right? So those are the key things to think about as it relates to implementation. This is the slide I mentioned, a timeline slide. I know there's a lot here to digest. I'm not going to read through all of it. Again, we're going to send out this deck to you all so you can take your time to go through it. It's color coded by general category, but really just at a glance, you can just see there's so many components of this new law that kick in at um, different times. And so for some provisions, there'll be more time to prepare than for others. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Eduardo to talk us through the immigration portions.
Thank you so much, Michael, and I look forward to answering everybody's questions. I hope that you have found this helpful so far. The reason why we are spotlighting the immigration components of this budget reconciliation bill and dedicating a few slides to those in particular is because, as Michael indicated early on in the presentation, we are looking at a bill that came together across committees and across jurisdictions, trying to piece together a Frankenstein monster of different policy objectives. And in essence, what folks are trying to do when they use the budget reconciliation process is trying to achieve policy change through budgetary means, right? Policy outcomes by changing the allocations that go toward an existing federal program, or how much you can cut from this program, or what fees you can increase or eliminate associated with certain programs. And it's a game of pluses and minuses with the objective of really changing, right? The social makeup, the eligibility, and the policy makeup of the country. So when we start to look into going into these next slides, um, the effects of the budget reconciliation bill as they're implemented when it comes to immigration detention and enforcement, we're not looking at the types of cuts and shifts that Michael described that go from federal to state budgets and that leave states on the hook, right? In many ways, what we are looking at is a supercharging of existing federal programs and the ability to reimburse states and local governments for their collaboration, their participation in enforcing immigration laws alongside federal authorities. So the bill's massive investments in the immigration enforcement workforce, this first pillar of hiring and retention enforcement, there are massive amounts of funds allocated here, using different theories of how to secure the border according to the administration's policies. Notably, there's a $10 billion fund that is basically unrestricted, right, for the purposes of border security. And they can do that, right? And that essentially is a way of saying we are giving free rein to federal law enforcement that conducts immigration enforcement, right? To use a significant pot of money however they see fit, so long as it is in some way related, right, to the policy objective of securing the border. There is an expansion of things that, are not particularly common when it comes to immigration detention. For example, the use of soft-sided facilities. That is typically something that is a rare occurrence, right? The term soft-sided facilities is a euphemism for what are essentially tent camps, right? And we have historically such an increase in the population that needs to be held or detained for whatever reason. We saw it under in the previous decade a few times when it came to unaccompanied children entering the United States in large numbers, needing to be held in shelters within various agencies' jurisdictions. Um, you look at the concerns about Medicaid cuts, right? That tells us that you can look at the $170 billion, right, that are specifically earmarked for immigration enforcement and think of those really as a sort of floor for what the impacts of the reconciliation bill are going to have on immigration in the United States. And on the migrant communities in the United States. And that's because so many of the Medicaid cuts are predicated on the fact that we can restrict eligibility to healthcare programs and to nutritional assistance programs, among others, right? Restrict the use of the ability for these communities to access those programs. And so we see how fee increases and benefit cuts end up being a great example of using budgetary means to achieve policy goals. We'll elaborate on that in the next slide. So to illustrate how injecting massive amounts of money into existing programs can really change the federal policy landscape. This is an illustration of how much more funding is now going on an average annual basis toward the ICE budget for detention than is going to the U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons, right? So our traditional prison system, where folks have been investigated, charged with a crime, prosecuted, went to trial or entered into a settlement, had some form of due process. That is the budget that we have on the books right now for the federal government to keep those folks in custody, just over $8 billion a year. When you look at the injection of funding under the Budget Reconciliation Act, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention budget becomes almost twice that, right? Approximately $14 billion a year through fiscal year 2029, right? So by supersizing existing federal programs, you essentially decide who is it that we are detaining, who is a priority, right, for the federal government to keep in custody for whatever purpose, and is it folks who have a criminal conviction in the case of the BOP, or is it people who are in detention for something that is a status violation, right, not having your paperwork, for example, or being an asylum seeker who missed a hearing, or being somebody who overstayed their visa, right? But we are spending a lot more in one than we are in the other. So going to the next slide, we see both parties use in recent years the budget reconciliation process in order to avoid the Senate filibuster, right? Ordinarily, when you're trying to get laws through the United States Congress, in the Senate, there is a mechanism for the party in the minority to hold up legislation and to extract some sort of concessions and negotiate, right? It is meant to avoid, right? The framers intended for this to avoid a one-party rule situation where one party can just set policy and trample over the minority party. Budget reconciliation is supposed to take away that ability of the minority party to delay or impede legislation in the Senate, as long as it is limited to certain necessary budget actions, right? So here are some concrete examples of how we are seeing the budgetary process of reconciliation used to achieve policy outcomes that the administration campaigned on and that their agency leaders supported, their supporters outside of the administration have asked for, right? Uh, it's it wouldn't be accurate to think of this bill as an immigration reform bill, right? It did not address any of the issues that folks have identified over decades on a bipartisan basis, right, with the United States immigration system. It doesn't assign the number of judges that we need. It doesn't provide for pathways to legal status for folks who have been here for a very long time, relief for dreamers, and a lot of things that have bipartisan support and that would be a component in a bipartisan reform bill. Instead, what the bill is doing is taking a ton of dollars and putting them into programs the administration likes, and then defunding programs that this administration does not like, while raising fees by a lot to achieve certain policy goals. So by the numbers, when you're looking at boosting hiring and the state and local partnerships, you're trying to achieve higher arrest rates. That's what the administration campaigned on. You may have heard of a little thing called Project 2025. This is all in there, and we have been led to believe that that was not ultimately the goal of the current administration, but they are making steady progress somehow toward implementing the objectives laid out in that plan. So with over $32 billion for hiring and retention budgets at ICE and at these Customs and Border Patrol, and $45 billion for immigration detention, particularly family detention, so that they can achieve the policy goal of eliminating certain protections for migrant children, right? If they're being held alongside adults, suddenly you don't have courts getting in the way of how you are caring for migrant children. This is also an objective laid out in Project 2025. And then if you raise fees so much that folks cannot adjust their status, become legal permanent residents, become citizens, take, for example, an unaccompanied child out of a shelter by vouching that they are their relative and that they will care for them. You make it so that they have to pay prohibitive fees or are deterred from making themselves known as a sponsor for that child. What you are doing is essentially restricting legal immigration, right? Boosting arrest rates, boosting the detention capacity in the country. And you're having, through family detention, the result of treating migrant children as adults, which is one of the objectives of Project 2025. So I want to open it up for questions now, right? And answer so much of this. And any questions that you have about all of this, but I just want to reiterate, right, that this was a pretty creative exercise by the authors of the bill to take what are numbers on a sheet of paper and use them to bypass the traditional legislative process and achieve a lot of the goals that the administration had set out for itself, either officially on its platform or through the campaign platform materials of their allies. And they're making steady progress because of this bill. So while Medicaid cuts and other provisions of the bill are going to be phased in over time, you may already be seeing in the news, and if you live in DC, the immediate effects of how supercharging the budgets for these agencies, how that is already being felt across communities.
Right. Thanks, Eduardo. Again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to address those. I'll give you a moment. Eduardo, thinking about this massive increase in funding for immigration enforcement, and then at the same time, reading stories about how ICE is spending time detaining individuals who are already on their way out, like trying to leave the country, and then detaining them and then putting them through a formal deportation procedure, which seems like a tremendous waste of resources. Going after, veterans. There was the case in Maine of the police officer from Jamaica who ICE went after, and even though the local police department used the E-Verify system that's supposed to, federal system to verify someone's eligibility for employment, but because that system was flawed, that person wasn't flagged. Um, Anyhow, it just seems like, you know, they're just almost like scraping the bottom of the barrel in a way, and it just makes me wonder, like, well, if there's nothing left for them to do, in terms of immigration enforcement, it just really concerns me how are these resources going to be used, um, in other ways, as we think about sort of the over-policing of different communities.
It's so stark, right? How using the budget reconciliation process instead of having a bipartisan debate on immigration reform, what it results in is a doubling down of some of the more broken aspects of immigration laws. And there's, recognition, you see in poll after poll, recognition across party lines that we need to fix our immigration system. But there's also this growing trend, this growing view that all we need to do is enforce current laws, which is sort of in tension with that, right? We don't need to fix the laws. They just need to be enforced. Well, you're seeing what happens when all you do is single-mindedly enforce the laws without regard for who should be a priority, without prioritizing public safety, prioritizing humanitarian concerns, the safety of children, keeping families together, things that, everybody with a beating heart cares about. But when you're just trying to hit quotas, uh, those things fall by the wayside.
Um, so let's question here in the chat, and this is perfect because I wanted to end on a positive note. And so thank you so much, Nelson, for teeing us up. And I'll just read it out. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. You're welcome. Greatly appreciate the detailed explanation. My question is, can a future Congress or administration reverse these onerous provisions? And if so, how quickly or slowly are they able to do so? So, you know, we didn't really touch on the clean energy and environmental components of this law very much. I mean, I made a brief mention in the beginning. Basically, this reconciliation bill reversed a lot of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that was for which the reconciliation process was used during the Biden administration in order to advance a number of policies, including clean energy policies. And you see now how this new reconciliation bill is repealing a lot of those provisions. So basically, the takeaway is that if there is alignment between the next administration and Congress in order to pass a new reconciliation bill, they can undo any of the provisions in this law that they see fit. So, and they can make that effective upon enactment, right? So within, really within months of a new administration and a new Congress, they could reverse significant or all of the provisions of this law, whatever they have the political will to do. Now, I know that waiting until after the 2028 election may seem like a very long time, and that is what it will take to reverse a lot of the provisions in this law. However, with the midterm elections, if there is a change in at least one of the chambers of Congress, while they won't be able to undo the law, because of course it would still take the president signing that into law, and current president presumably would not sign something into law that reverses his own signature legislative accomplishment. They certainly can hold more oversight hearings into the implementation of the law and really shine a spotlight on how the law is having a disproportionate impact on struggling families, and families that the president claimed he was going to support when he ran for his current term. And then the other thing to point out as well, as I had raised earlier, a lot of provisions require agency guidance, right? So even if after 2028 we have a new administration, but maybe not, maybe the administration's allies don't control a majority in both chambers of Congress and aren't able to change the entire law, they will be able to change the guidance for implementing the law, right? So there will be some at least subtle or not so subtle changes that they'll be able to make to how it's implemented. So we do have that to look forward to. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there. But I know that all of us working together can hopefully help us get there. And with that, just want to thank you all for joining us again today, for tuning in. Again, we'll get these slides out to you, and look forward to answering any questions that you have over email. Eduardo, any last words?
Well, I do want to point out, right, that this was a budgetary process, and we're about to head into a slightly more significant budgetary process because of the potential for a government shutdown, right? The fiscal year ends September 30th. So when Congress gets back into session, they'll still be debating the implementation of this bill, the concept of rescissions, and the administration's ability to unilaterally decide not to fund something. And that's going to be very relevant for whoever is in the White House after, right? And how Congress conducts its appropriations business and decides to fund federal programs. So that will be a key thing to watch when it comes to whether we can pare back any of the harmful aspects of this bill, and what's going to be able to be negotiated at all.
Yeah, yeah. So
This is
a lot
great.
more to come. Stay tuned. All right. Thank you, everybody.